Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Monday, April 13th lecture in Media and Politics. I hope that you are all doing really well and had a great weekend, and that everybody is healthy and staying safe. I'm recording this on Sunday night, and my youngest kid, Patrick, had his second birthday yesterday, Saturday, and we threw him a little birthday party that was just my immediate family, but we Skyped with his, or not Skyped, but Zoomed with his grandparents and some aunts and uncles, and had a birthday to remember. Even though it was hopefully one that we won't have to do again, but nevertheless, it was a good day, and he's two, so he ate a lot of cake and then completely crashed a little later on, about an hour afterward, and was crying uncontrollably about something that didn't even make any sense. Acting like a 2-year-old does, I guess. But anyway, we had a great weekend, and I hope y'all did too. So, on tap for today, we are going to be talking about social media, also known, it's kind of an outdated term now, but as Web 2.0. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what is interesting about this is the last time I taught this class, which I know um, I've mentioned before, was 4 years ago, which is hard to believe. I found that even though we talked a lot about social media in that class, it did not dominate the discussion to the extent that it has in our class this semester. And so, even though this is the week on social media and the week on Web 2.0, I feel like in many ways we've been talking about this stuff now basically throughout the entire semester. So, hopefully, we'll do so this week in kind of a focused way. The three readings that were assigned this week are, but one's from the New Yorker and two are from the magazine Wired, which is about technology. If you've never read Wired, they have great coverage about stuff on the internet and technology and the intersection between technology and politics. And so we're going to be moving a little bit away from the academic literature and talking more about just what's been happening on social media over the last 3 or 4 years, and how is it affecting politics? And not only that, how is it affecting our lives, and how is it affecting the lives and the sort of livelihoods of these companies that make these apps and these programs that we all use all the time. So we're going to start by talking through history of social media in the United States, as well as sort of my own personal history with social media. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't sat down to think about it before or stopped to think about it, like when did you first get a Facebook account? When did you join Instagram? When did you join Snapchat? When did you write your first tweet? And why? So we'll talk a little bit about some of that tonight. And then we'll also talk about how Americans generally tend to use social media and how it differs by various demographic groups, some overall trends, the kind of meaning behind those trends, and then we'll get to Facebook, which is the subject of, like I said, the readings for this week, and is a really interesting sort of case study that kind of follows the trajectory of what we've talked about a lot in class, which is this idea of social media and the internet bringing people closer together. And yes, it can have that effect, but in many ways too, it can be very, personally and socially isolating, and can lead obviously to the spread of disinformation. So we'll talk through some of those things both in today's lecture and Wednesdays. So social media, for our purposes, refer to websites and applications that enable users to both create and then, crucially, share content or participate in social networking. And there are sort of four criteria. This comes from a 2015 peer-reviewed meta-analysis paper of studies that have tried to really define social media and get a handle on exactly what is and is not social media. And they kind of came up with four criteria. So the first one is that social media are these Web 2.0 internet-based applications, right? So if there's not an internet-based component to it, it cannot be social media. Secondly, that user-generated content is the lifeblood of the social media organism, right? So think about visiting the NewYorkTimes.com for example, the lifeblood of that website, which is very important to many people, is not stuff that we're creating, right? It's stuff that the New York Times journalists are creating. And yes, stories can have a comment section, and those comment sections can be quite lively at times, and even in their best sort of iteration, can be informative. In their worst, they're obviously a cesspool. But nevertheless, nobody's going to New York Times to read the comments, right? So it's not user-generated content. On the other hand, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, that's all user-generated content, right? Nobody's going to Facebook to see what Facebook itself is posting. Thirdly, users tend to create service-specific profiles for the site or app that are then designed and maintained by the social media organization. So you have your Twitter profile, you have your Facebook profile, you have your Instagram account, you have Snapchat, right? You have this expression of yourself that is online, that is through the sort of parameters set up by the social media company. And then fourth and finally, they facilitate the development of online social networks by then connecting that user's profile with those of other individuals or groups. Sometimes that connection can be a user sort of led process. Sometimes it can be led by the company itself. If any of you guys are on LinkedIn, you know that LinkedIn is very proactive about trying to connect its users. Other companies like Twitter, for example, is not very proactive about doing that at all. So that can differ, but the key here is connection. So if we're going to think back to the roots of social media, try and figure out where it comes from, at the end of the day, focusing on its sort of core tenet is this idea of connection, right? And so in some ways, even before the invention of the telegraph in 1840, anything that can allow users of some medium to feel connected is in some way social media, right? So even if it is books, for example, newspapers, but truthfully, what added the instantaneous sort of connection between people who are socially distant from each other, speaking of a term that has relevance for all of us right now, was the invention of the telegraph by the United States in 1840, which connected the US from coast to coast. And then going from there, particularly in the World War II era, after the sort of military-industrial complex got ramped up, and you had, in particular, defense projects that got a lot of funding. So you saw some of the creation of these things shift to universities. So, for example, the University of Illinois launched the Plato system in 1960, which was an early sort of way for people to connect network to network. ARPANET, and I'll talk more about ARPANET in a second, but it launched in 1967. And ARPANET and its users saw the introduction of what we would call net etiquette, but netiquette, which was first described by the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in 1982. And ARPANET actually evolved into the internet in 1974. So we're talking about things that, happened relatively recently. And I know that for you guys who are freshmen, you were born, in 2001. So this seems like ancient history to you, but I was born in 1984, and so this is only 10 years before I was born. Some of you in this class I know were probably born before 1974. So again, this is not history for many of us. It's at most recent history, and it also is something that is very current for a lot of people, right? So these early conceptions of the internet became the foundation of Usenet, which was established in 1980. And Usenet sort of started with what technology people call bulletin board service companies, or BBS companies. And they had these internal, essentially company-wide bulletin board services where you could post via a very rudimentary computer and then have people in other locations read what you said. And some companies that were involved in these early BBS systems were CompuServe, Prodigy, and AOL. And they were some of the first BBS companies to actually migrate to the internet. They were followed by GeoCities, which was formed in 1994, Classmates, which was formed in 1995, and the social network 6 Degrees, which was formed in 1997. 6 Degrees is actually pretty interesting. All of these websites included profiles, they included friend lists, and they included school affiliations. And these were followed by, starting in sort of the late 90s with Open Diary, early 2000s with LiveJournal. 2003, I believe, saw the introduction of Friendster and LinkedIn. MySpace was also in 2003, Orkut, and of course Facebook, which was founded by Mark Zuckerberg at Harvard University in February of 2004. And my own history with Facebook, it's probably not interesting to anybody but me, but I can remember very clearly when I first heard of it. So in the fall semester of 2004, I spent the fall of 2004 studying abroad at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And I know that none of us are, we're not even studying at school right now, much less abroad, but I would highly, highly encourage you to try and do it if you can afford it. Sometimes it's actually cheaper than going to school in the US, if you can believe it. But it was probably one of the best experiences of my life. But regardless, I was living in this dorm actually with a lot of American students, and a lot of the students in the program that I studied abroad with were from kind of big, fancy East Coast universities like Harvard, Dartmouth, Boston College, etc. And this was, again, fall of 2004, so it was 7 or 8 months after Facebook was started at Harvard, and they all had it. And our dorm had a computer lab in the basement that had computers that were connected to the internet, and believe it or not, nobody had Wi-Fi in their dorm rooms at the time. This doesn't seem like that long ago, but apparently it was. And so all of these students that were my friends that I had met on study abroad, they all had Facebook, and they'd spend obviously a lot of time on it because that's what people do with Facebook in the computer lab. And I was really jealous because I thought it looked really cool. It was another way of kind of expressing yourself, which I think in college we're all trying to figure out how we want to present ourselves to the world. And so I remember coming back to Texas at the Christmas break and going back, and I know I've mentioned before, but I went to Austin College, so a little small liberal arts college in Sherman, and Austin College was not on Mark Zuckerberg's expansion list, I don't think, early on. So anyway, Facebook did not come to Austin College until late spring of 2005, so over a year after it was started at Harvard. And I signed up immediately, and I've been on it ever since. So I am a very, very early user of Facebook. Not the earliest, obviously, because it was Mark Zuckerberg's acquaintances probably at Facebook or at Harvard who have the oldest profiles. But I have now been on Facebook for about 15 years, I would imagine. So, which is hard to believe how much time that is, really, and how much of my life that represents. But here we are, and it's not something I think about all the time. But I have, quite clearly been on it for a really long time. And I've got friends who have had profiles that they've deleted. I have other friends who use Facebook a lot. I wouldn't say I use it a lot. I use it sometimes. I check it pretty much every day. But I rarely ever post. Sometimes I'll comment on something that somebody else posts, but I'm probably not what you would call a very active user. I'm more active on Twitter and Instagram than I am on Facebook. I use it primarily probably for like invites for social things. So like, for example, one of my kids' friends will have a birthday party and the parents will send out an invite to the other parents on Facebook. And it seems really useful for that. Obviously, I could just use Evite or something too, but I probably don't know everybody's email addresses. So, and we'll talk about people sort of my age and how they're using Facebook today, and people who are your age and how they're using Facebook, and people who are older, like maybe my parents' age, and how they're using Facebook, because for all of us it differs quite a bit. So I found this chart to be really interesting. This is the percentage of population in America using some form of social media. So you can see in 2005, that year that I joined Facebook, 5%, right? So 5 out of every 100 people in the United States were on a social media website. They had a profile. By 2011, that jumped 45%. So in 6 years, a full half of all Americans were on social media. And now, 8 years after that, in 2019, almost three-quarters of Americans have some social media account. And I wish that we were all in person because I would ask you if you all do. And I'm sure the answer um, would be yes. There may be one or two of you that don't. I'd love to hear the reasons why. But nevertheless, we are social distancing, so we're going to have to do this online. All right, so how is social media growing? So young people are still social media's biggest users, but older Americans have seen very sharp recent growth. YouTube and Facebook are by far the most popular social media sites in America. They're used by somewhere between 50 to almost 70% of the US population. LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and Snapchat. Also, you need to include Reddit in this list, but they take up smaller shares. So for each of these, somewhere between, I don't know, 12 and 22% of the American population. 75% of Facebook users, I found this very interesting fact, visit the site every single day. That's true also for 6 in 10 users of Instagram. Facebook in particular is obviously worth talking about because it has come to dominate so much of the political conversation in America. It had such an outsized effect on the 2016 presidential election. And if you don't believe that, just ask a Trump campaign manager, right? We've talked about this. We talked about it a few weeks ago, but they'll admit that they think their candidate would not have won in 2016 without Facebook. So 69% of the American population has a Facebook account. 75% of all women in the US are on Facebook compared to 63% of all men. 74% of adults with a college education have an account, and 61% who have a high school diploma or less have an account. Almost 80% of 18 to 29-year-olds use it. So that's y'all's demo. 46% of 65 and older, so my parents' demo, almost fully half of them have Facebook accounts, which is truly remarkable to me, and sort of thinking about what the site was like back when I joined it in 2005. And the share of older Americans who use Facebook has doubled since August of 2012. So among teenagers, YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat, and of course, Facebook owns Instagram. One of the articles talks a little bit about Mark Zuckerberg's purchase of Instagram. He bought Instagram for, I believe, $1 billion when it had only 13 employees, and a lot of people scoffed at the price. It's now worth probably 100 times that, so it was a solid investment for Facebook. But YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat are the most popular online platforms among teenagers. 85% of teens report using YouTube, 72% report having an Instagram account, and 69% are on Snapchat. Facebook is actually at 51% of usage among teenagers, which is down over the last 5 to 6 years from 71%. So that is a sort of sharp downward trend that has officials at Facebook very worried. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Lower income teenagers, however, are more likely to use Facebook than higher income teens. 40% of all American adults report that they get news from Facebook. 54% of Facebook users in the US have adjusted their privacy settings sometimes in the last year. I find that to be an astoundingly high number and much higher than I would have guessed. And 40% of users self-report having taken a break from checking the website for 2 or more weeks, which I've also found interesting. 53% of the American public says that they don't understand why certain posts are included in their newsfeed and others are not. 20% say they have literally no understanding of this at all. 74%, so almost 3/4 of users, claimed that they had no idea that Facebook maintained a list of their interests and traits. Almost 60% said that their interests were accurately reflected by Facebook, and 27% said that those traits were not at all accurate. So, what allowed for the rise of Facebook and the rise of social media in the early 2000s? So, by the time 2003, 2004 rolled around, the tech industry had recovered from the dot-com bust, which happened in the early 2000s. The internet was increasingly popular, so it wasn't, it was no longer these sort of online bulletin boards that were comprised of a very niche group of users. Instead, they were reaching critical mass of users. Um, and there was obviously no scarcity of people out there who could log on and create profiles. But nevertheless, the internet it still is pretty much an unregulated environment. But in the early 2000s, it was even more unregulated now. And first movers, so people who were the first to enter, companies who were the first to enter a marketplace, could amass really, really huge followings and then consolidate power. And then, of course, in 2007, Apple introduced the first iteration of the iPhone, and inexpensive smartphones would bring millions and millions of more people online. And then obviously these social media companies would make the pivot to mobile technology. And most importantly, the creators of these companies soon realized that users would be increasingly willing to hand over colossal amounts of personal information for free. Sean Parker, who was in the movie The Social Network, who's an early investor and kind of arguably a co-founder of Facebook, but he described Facebook's expertise as exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And what he means by this is that people are addicted to Facebook. And for example, Facebook has found that whenever they would send an email to a user saying that somebody had tagged them in a photo, they had almost a 100% click rate on the link in that photo. So users were finding it nearly impossible not to log on after saying that they were tagged in a photo. In 2010, Facebook added an I voted button that allowed people to click only after they had voted in the midterms, and this increased turnout by 340,000 people. It's estimated in the 2010 midterms. So there's a real kind of social herd quality to Facebook, clearly. Yet in 2007, Facebook's growth had plateaued. So if you think about it, the sort of first group of users that they had graduated college, right? And I don't know if y'all know this, I assume you do, but in order to have a Facebook account, probably for the first 2 or 3 years of the website's existence, you needed a .edu email address, right? So this meant that faculty members at universities could get on, but also only college students could get on. So MySpace at the time was the alternative to Facebook, and the people I knew who were not enrolled in college, they tended to turn to MySpace, whereas Facebook was mostly focused on college students. But nevertheless, in 2000, its growth had plateaued. And so Facebook was trying to figure out how to get more users, how to scale upward dramatically. And in the end, the only way for a free social media site to make money is to gain as many users as possible, who, of course, are willing to give up their information to use the site. So they offered the website in additional languages, Chinese, for example, Indonesian, which opened up an enormous marketplace. And they also asked the Federal Elections Commission for an exemption to its rule that required that political ads donors be named. And the article from the New Yorker describes this period and really Facebook's whole existence as being driven by a religion of growth. They also opened the site up to third-party developers to allow Facebook to allow developers to then sort of make their own content using Facebook. So if Facebook were a country, it would have the largest population on Earth, 2.2 billion people. which, by the way, there are more people on Facebook than there are adherents to Christianity on Earth. Facebook earns more money in ad revenue every year than all American newspapers combined. And a peer-reviewed study found that in 5,000 users who were followed over 3 years, higher usage of Facebook correlated with declines in not only physical and mental health, but also life satisfaction. And so the stakes for Facebook have been, are, and will be super large. And the question is, how does a social media company grapple with some of the most foundational aspects of human existence, such as the meaning of truth, the limits of free speech, and the origins of violence? And should Facebook be the arbiter of truth for 2.2 billion people who are its users? Can it be the arbiter of truth? Is it even possible? And it's hard for us now to understand just how little these questions probably entered Mark Zuckerberg's mind when he was sitting in his dorm room in Cambridge, Massachusetts in late 2003 and early 2004, getting Facebook up and running. He mentioned to friends early on that he created the website to meet girls, right? And so it obviously touched a nerve, as all sort of successful startups who are entering and disrupting new marketplaces do. Because if you now fast forward 16 years, and I mean, gosh, almost a third of the Earth's population is on Facebook and has a Facebook account and is willingly turning over personal information to then become data for Facebook to then place ads in our news feeds, which is how they make money. And so we'll talk more on Wednesday about these questions, right? So, how does Facebook as a social media company determine what truth is? Should they be in the business of determining what truth is? Should they be in the business of limiting anybody's speech? Obviously, First Amendment rights exist in the United States, but they don't exist online. And anything you post on Facebook, that is not the same as going outside and yelling into the sky. So we'll talk about this. Facebook's come under a lot of fire, particularly from the American political right, for silencing and censoring views. On the other hand, they were integral to the election of Donald Trump, which I don't think anybody on America's left is very excited about either. And so they're dealing with some really tricky aspects of the human existence that they are not only affecting, but they're greatly affecting. And the way that they can affect people's behavior through what appears in the newsfeed is truly remarkable, and is something that we will spend quite a bit of time talking about on Wednesday. So for now, I hope that all of you have a great week, and I look forward to reading your discussion post that you're turning in tonight. And again, this is Sunday, which I'm recording this lecture the night before I'm going to post it. So I look forward to reading your discussion board posts. And stay safe out there, everyone. And I will talk to you again on Wednesday.